On the 11th day, I stopped checking the response queue. Not because I had given up, or perhaps precisely because I had, and there is no shame left in admitting it. The Accord of Seneth had been broadcasting across 17 channels since the third day of the drift. 17 channels. Every faction frequency, every mutual aid band the old Confederacy had ratified in the years when ratification still meant something. Emergency wavelengths, trade band courtesy calls, the general distress frequencies listed in the Velathi Corridor Navigation Compact, which we had signed in the fourth year of the conclave, and which 17 other signatories had apparently never bothered to store in active memory. Broadcast our position, our status, our remaining power margin. We broadcast the number of people aboard, 412 velathi souls, 11 of them in the medical hold with injuries the ship's remaining surgeon described as stabilized, which is the word surgeons use when they mean not yet dead. We broadcast everything. The stars received it with perfect indifference. I am Orvith Das. I was Magistrate Coordinator of the Velathi Confederacy's 9th Administrative Council before the Confederacy became a word we used, in the past tense. My title as of the 11th day of the drift was whatever a Magistrate Coordinator becomes when the institution dissolves around him and leaves him standing in its wreckage. Still wearing the formal collar plates of office, still filing reports to a central authority that no longer existed to receive them. I filed them anyway. It was, perhaps, the only act of genuine governance left available to me. The Accord of Seneth was not a warship. She had been built as a council conveyance, wide corridors, conference chambers, a public gallery with a vaulted ceiling, meant to imply that the Velathi people were governed by something worthy of ceremony. She had no weapons to speak of, and no military escort, because in the years when she was commissioned, the Confederacy had not imagined it would need to defend its council from the consequences of its own collapse. The propulsion array had failed on the second day of the drift, a cascade failure that our chief engineer described with the flat, careful voice of a person who has already worked through the implications and chosen not to share them aloud. We had emergency thrusters. We had 2 weeks of life support reserve at reduced draw. We had 17 channels broadcasting into silence. What we did not have was any expectation that the silence would end. I was standing at the observation deck on the morning of the 12th day when the Undivided arrived. I say morning because we had kept ship time running, another small act of administrative stubbornness, maintaining a schedule when the schedule had nothing to fill it. The observation deck was a long curve of reinforced glass set into the Accord's crossspine, designed so that council members could look out at the systems they governed and feel appropriately elevated. Now it looked out at the Velathi Corridor drift zone, which is not elevated and not governed by anyone, a long, slow eddy in the stellar current where vessels with failed drives tend to accumulate, very gradually, like sediment. There were 3 other hulks visible at distance. 2 Velathi merchant vessels that had been there longer than we had, dark and quiet, and a Velathi prospector, with a compromised hull that had stopped broadcasting anything 3 days prior. The Undivided came in on a deceleration burn that was longer than it needed to be. I know that now, because one of her crew explained it to me later. They had calculated our observation angle and adjusted the approach so the engine bloom would be visible to us from the deck before any other sensor confirmed their arrival, so that we would see a light moving against the drift and know it was coming toward us, not passing through. A small consideration. I did not know that at the time. I only knew that I was looking at a point of moving light where the drift had shown nothing for 11 days, and the light was getting larger, and my hands, I noticed this with some clinical distance, had pressed flat against the glass. She was not what I expected. I had not truly expected anything. But in the part of me that had not entirely surrendered the possibility of rescue, I had imagined something. A Confederacy faction ship finally responding to obligation, or a Velathi Corridor Authority vessel, or perhaps one of the large, heavily crewed aid convoys the Galactic Cooperative dispatched to disasters of sufficient political visibility. What I saw was a human heavy transport, a working freighter, broad-hulled, with the identifier T's Undivided, along her port flank in letters I could read clearly. As she drew alongside, she was carrying cargo. Could see the external container brackets along her lower hull, still loaded. She had not offloaded her freight before coming. She had simply turned around, mid-run, and come. The hail arrived 40 seconds before she matched our drift. Accord of Seneth. This is T Undivided, Captain Beru Nathal commanding. We received your broadcast on Channel 11, trade band courtesy frequency. 8 hours out, we've turned back. A pause, not long but considered. Tell me what you need first. Tell me what you need first. Not. We are establishing whether we have jurisdiction. Not. We are consulting with our dispatch authority. Not. We are awaiting confirmation from the relevant treaty body. Tell me what you need first. As if the only question of any urgency was the practical one, and the practical one was fully within reach. I had my communications officer patch me through with some difficulty, because our communications board had been running on reduced power for 6 days, and 3 of its secondary arrays had burned out on the second day of casting. My own voice, when it came, was steadier than I had expected. Captain Nathal, our propulsion array is a full cascade failure. We have 412 aboard. 11 require medical attention. Life support reserves at approximately 14 days. Reduced draw. Paused. We have been broadcasting for 11 days. Understood. Another pause. Shorter. We're coming alongside. I'm sending 2 engineers through your port docking collar in about 20 minutes. Daya is our trauma medic. Come with them if your medical hold will take her. The voice was calm, not warm. Exactly. Not the warmth of someone performing reassurance for an anxious patient. The warmth of someone who has assessed the situation, found it workable, and is already 3 steps into solving it. We've got some structural analysis tools and a spare motivator coil. Probably not a full fix, but we'll get you moving. The port docking collar engaged with a sound I had not heard in 11 days. The mechanical certainty of a seal completing. I stood at the observation deck for a moment longer, watching the Undivided's hull against the glass, close enough now that I could see the wear markings along her maintenance panels, the practical, unglamorous evidence of a ship that worked for a living. She was not built for rescue. She was not staffed for rescue. She had a crew of 9, I learned later. Captain Nathal, 2 engineers, a medic, a navigator, and 4 others whose roles I catalogued over the following hours with reflex of a man who has spent 30 years keeping administrative records. They had been carrying industrial sealant, compound, and agricultural processing components to a station at the far end of the corridor. They had a delivery schedule. They had turned around anyway. I went down to the port collar to meet them. 2 engineers came through first. A tall woman named Sergeant Okafor, who carried a diagnostic case in each hand and moved through our corridor with the ease of someone who has boarded unfamiliar vessels before and found them all, more or less, comprehensible. And a younger man she introduced only as Preet, who was already consulting a handheld schematic of velathi propulsion architecture before the collar. Seal had fully equalized. Behind them came Daya, the medic, who was small and moved quickly and took in the corridor, the reduced lighting, the smell of a ship that had been running on conservation protocols for 11 days, and simply said, "Medical hold," and waited for someone to show her where it was. I showed her myself. She did not comment on what she found in the hold. She asked questions. Symptoms, timelines, what treatments had already been administered, and she listened with the focused attention of someone building a picture she intends to act on. Our surgeon, Physician Sethan Orville, had been awake for most of the 11 days. I watched him absorb the fact of another medical professional in the room, and then, carefully, allow himself to accept it. I left them to their work and returned to the observation deck. Because I did not know what else to do with myself, and because I had spent 11 days looking out at the nothing, it seemed right to look out at the something now that the something was there. The Undivided's engineers were in our propulsion bay for 6 hours. I received status updates at irregular intervals. Sergeant Okafor had found the failure cascade's origin point, a stress fracture in the primary motivator housing. The spare coil they carried was a close enough match that a modified mounting would hold. They were fabricating the mount adaptation with equipment from their own maintenance stores. At one point, she sent a query to our engineering chief, asking whether our reserve power allocation could be redirected for 90 minutes to stabilize the bay temperature during the coil installation. Our chief said yes before I had finished reading the request. Captain Athol came aboard herself in the third hour. She was a compact person, with the look of someone accustomed to making assessments quickly and then getting on with things. She found me on the observation deck. I am not certain how she knew where to look, though I suspect she simply checked the most logical place for a senior administrator to stand when he has no active administrative function and is instead watching his situation resolve around him. She sat beside me on the bench along the inner rail of the deck and looked out at the drift zone for a moment without speaking. 14 days of life support was enough, she said. We'd have come regardless, but the margin helped. You were 8 hours out, I said. You reversed your delivery run. We were 8 hours out, she agreed. Your cargo, it'll keep. She considered the drift zone. The two dark velathi merchants sat at distance, and the velathi prospector, the slow geometry of everything adrift. We'll reroute after. Station will wait. I watched her face and profile and tried to find the shape of the calculation that had produced that decision, the arithmetic of a cargo delivery, schedule against 412 lives in a drift zone. On Channel 11, the trade band courtesy frequency, the one we had included because it cost nothing to include. She did not look like a person who had made a difficult calculation. She looked like a person for whom the calculation had been simple. 17 factions received our broadcast, I said. She didn't answer that. She nodded once, looking out at the drift. Your people may file for reimbursement of magistrate. She said it without sharpness, just the word. Then, let's get you moving first. The motivator coil installation completed at the 19th hour of their arrival. Sergeant Okafor sent a terse message to the bridge. Primary propulsion restored to 63% efficiency, sufficient for standard drift zone exit and corridor transit at reduced speed. She recommended we make for the nearest station with full engineering facilities and not test the motivator above 2/3 output until a proper housing replacement could be sourced. She listed 3 stations within range and noted that the nearest had a velathi administrative liaison office in case we required documentation support. She had looked that up. She had included it because it might be useful. The Accord of Seneth moved for the first time in 11 days. I felt it as a vibration through the deck plating, faint, because 63% is not a triumphal burn, but real. The stars in the observation glass shifted slowly, and the drift zone began to fall behind us, and the 2 dark velathi merchants remained where they were. And I filed a record, noting their positions and registries for the station authority, because that was something I could do, and I intended to do everything I could. The Undivided's crew departed through the port collar 2 hours after we achieved transit speed. Aya had stabilized all 11 patients and left physician Orville a detailed treatment protocol written in careful trade script, along with a supply kit pulled from her own ship's medical inventory. She had not asked whether she could take from it. Sergeant Okafor and Preet left our engineering bay cleaner than they had found it, which is not a thing I had thought to expect, and which I noted in the record. Captain Nathal came to the collar last. She shook my hand in the human fashion, gripping the primary hand fully, brief pressure and release. And then she said the only thing she said that I have thought about regularly in the years since. You kept broadcasting. That was the right call. She meant it practically. She meant, your signal was on Channel 11, and we heard it, and the fact that you had kept it running after the first week was why we had a position to vector to. She meant it as operational feedback from one professional to another. I understood that. Also understood that 11 days of broadcasting into silence, with diminishing power reserves and 17 empty frequencies is not simply an operational decision. It is the decision to believe, against all available evidence, that silence is not the final answer, to keep speaking into it anyway, on the small chance that somewhere in the 17 channels, there is one that carries the word to someone who will turn around. She released my hand and went back through the collar, and the seal closed. I returned to the observation deck and sat down at the administrative console I had moved there on the 4th day of the drift. When it became clear, I would be spending a great deal of time looking at nothing, and might as well have the means to file reports while I did it. I opened the record I had been maintaining, event log, Accord of Seneth, drift incident, Verath corridor, and I wrote the final entry for that day. Day 12 of drift incident. Propulsion restored to 63% efficiency by crew of Terran Heavy Transport T's Undivided. Captain Baru Nathal commanding. 9 crew, cargo, industrials and agricultural freight, delivery deferred, medical support provided by Trauma Medic, designation DIA. 11 critical patients stabilized, engineering support, full cascade failure partially remediated, transit capability restored. Transit commenced at 1847 ship time toward Verath Station 11. No reimbursement filed. No treaty obligation invoked. Jurisdictional basis established. The vessel received our broadcast on Channel 11 and reversed course. I paused. Outside the glass, the Verath corridor stretched ahead of us, lit by the patient in different light of distant stars. The same stars that had received 11 days of signal and returned nothing. The Accord of Seneth moved through them now under her own power, however reduced, and in her medical hold, 11 people were sleeping rather than dying, and in the corridor below the observation deck I could hear, still, the sound of velathi voices speaking to each other in a register I had not heard in 11 days, which is the register of people who believe, on reasonable evidence, that tomorrow is a thing that will arrive. I added one line to the record. This entry is the first complete administrative record filed by the Ninth Council of the Velathi Confederacy in 4 years. It concerns a human freighter that was 8 hours away and turned around. I saved it. I closed the console. I sat for a while longer looking at the stars, and this time, they did not look like silence. They looked like distance, which is a different thing entirely.